You're about to hear a story of scars, instincts, and a second chance that came wrapped in golden fur. What would you do if the very dog you planned to give away turned out to be the only one who could save your family? Stay with us. This tale might just change how you see loyalty forever. If you're touched by stories of quiet heroes and unexpected miracles, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end. This is one you won't want to miss. Mountain Hollow, Colorado, in early spring, was a place where the wind still whispered winter's name. The snow had retreated from the roads but lingered stubbornly in shaded patches beneath the towering evergreens. The air carried the scent of wet earth and pine, and the sky was a canvas of gray silk, stretched thin between sun and storm. It was into this quiet corner of the world that the Campbell family arrived, seeking peace, renewal, and a new beginning, far from the rush of Denver's clamor. Joshua Campbell, a man in his late 30s with a lean, muscular build and deep-set eyes the color of dark coffee, stood on the gravel driveway surveying the modest log cabin they had purchased on Sycamore Hill. He wore a battered baseball cap over his short, dark brown hair, and the worn flannel shirt he favored made him look more like a lumberjack than the former IT technician he used to be. Josh had grown quiet over the past year, changed by months of unemployment and the crushing pressure of keeping his young family afloat after being laid off. The move to Mountain Hollow wasn't just a relocation, it was a last-ditch effort to start over. Beside him, Melissa Campbell wrapped her arms around her coat, her green eyes squinting toward the pine-draped horizon. She was in her mid-30s, tall, with a slender frame and auburn hair always pulled back in a low, tidy bun. A third-grade teacher by trade, Melissa had a calm, methodical demeanor that masked an ocean of emotion beneath. She had always been the stable one, the planner. The years of infertility treatments had weathered her with quiet grief, but when their miracle baby Caleb arrived nearly a year ago, something in her brightened. Now she carried herself with the fierce protectiveness of a lioness, never straying far from their child. Caleb, 10 months old, with chubby cheeks and a mop of soft blonde curls, was buckled safely in a carrier strapped to Melissa's chest. His eyes, startlingly blue, like his father's, flitted curiously over the surroundings. He made a soft cooing sound as a gust of wind stirred the pine needles around them. They had only just started unpacking when Melissa mentioned visiting the local animal shelter. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, watching Josh as he tightened a bolt on the front porch railing. "This place, it's quiet, maybe too quiet. Caleb will need companionship. I've read studies dogs help children's development." Josh glanced up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "A dog? Right now? Mel, we're barely settled in." But Melissa's voice held a rare insistence. "Not just any dog. I saw one on the shelter's website. I think we should meet him." The shelter was tucked behind the town's water tower, a squat brick building with ivy crawling up its sides. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of antiseptic and dog fur. Most of the kennels held young, eager mutts who barked and jumped excitedly at the sight of visitors. But in the back corner, lying motionless on a fleece mat, was Rusty. Rusty was a large golden retriever, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a heavy frame, matted golden fur dulled by time, and a face marked by pale scars that slashed across his muzzle and ears. One eye was clouded slightly with age, but the other glowed amber with quiet intelligence. His tail didn't wag when they approached. He simply lifted his head and watched them, his expression unreadable but alert. The shelter attendant, a young woman named Cassie with short pink hair and a sleeve of tattoos, approached quietly. "That's Rusty. Came in last year. He's a bit of a mystery case, transferred from a city shelter. Used to be a K-9, we think bomb detection or search and rescue. Nobody ever claimed him. He doesn't like loud voices, spooks around certain noises, but he's housebroken. Good with kids, just keeps to himself." Melissa crouched, holding Caleb's carrier in front of Rusty. The baby reached out, hand chubby and wobbling. Rusty slowly sniffed the air, then leaned forward and gently pressed his nose to Caleb's fingers. The contact was soft, reverent. Caleb giggled. Josh had crossed his arms. "That dog's half dead." "He's scarred," Melissa replied quietly, "but not broken." They brought Rusty home that evening. The dog explored the house in a slow, deliberate pattern, his claws ticking against the pine floors. He avoided sudden movement, flinched when the furnace kicked on, and refused to step near the kitchen's back vent. But when they laid Caleb down for a nap, Rusty curled up beside the crib without being told. His body stiffened every time the baby shifted, alert and protective. Melissa began researching. Late that night, as wind tapped at the window panes, she sat beside Josh reading aloud. Golden retrievers have been used for gas detection in industrial sites. Their sense of smell is incredibly sensitive. Look at this. Dogs have been known to alert handlers to chemical leaks undetectable to human senses. Josh raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Are you saying he's some kind of old superhero? Melissa shrugged, a half smile playing at her lips. Maybe he just has good instincts. By the second week, Rusty had become a fixture in their daily life. He followed Melissa from room to room. When Caleb cried, he beat her to the nursery. Every evening, as Josh stacked firewood outside or fixed creaky floorboards, Rusty kept a silent watch from the front steps. Still, he never barked, never begged, never played. He simply observed, as if measuring the safety of everything around him. One morning, as snow flurried lightly outside and frost clung to the windows, Melissa noticed something odd. Rusty was scratching obsessively at a spot beside the kitchen cabinet near the floor vent. His claws dug, not at the baseboard, but toward the floor beneath. When she called his name, he ignored her for the first time. Josh brushed it off. Probably some dead squirrel under the house. But Melissa watched Rusty's eyes. They weren't curious. They were calculating. That night, she lay awake with Caleb sleeping beside her in the bassinet, and Rusty curled at the foot of the bed. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the furnace. But something had shifted in the air. A tension, like the house itself was holding its breath. And Rusty, though still, did not sleep. His ears twitched at each creak. His eyes stayed open, always on the baby. The third week in Mountain Hollow arrived with a hush in the air, the kind that presses on your eardrums and makes even a ticking clock sound too loud. The snow had melted into cold mud, and thick fog rolled in from the hills each morning, clinging to the porch railings like pale fingers. It was the kind of weather that blurred everything, boundaries, intentions, even instincts. And in the middle of that quiet disarray, Rusty began to change. At first, the differences were subtle. The golden retriever, whose thick golden coat still bore the memories of old battles in the form of puckered scars and healed wounds, had always been solemn. But now he was restless. His amber eye darted constantly to the corners of the room. He ignored meals. He paced in tight circles in the kitchen, head low, ears twitching. He kept pressing his snout to the base of the floor vents, especially the one behind the refrigerator, and would emit a soft huff as if something offended him. Melissa noticed it while prepping breakfast one Tuesday. She stood barefoot on the pine floorboards, her long cardigan brushing her calves as she watched Rusty stare into nothing. His paws were planted at the edge of the kitchen tiles, tail stiff, eyes locked on the floor vent. Caleb babbled in his high chair behind her, smeared banana on his cheeks. But Rusty didn't move, even when Caleb shrieked in delight. She crouched beside the dog and placed a hand on his scruffy neck. He was trembling. Later that afternoon, she brought Rusty to the veterinary clinic near the town square, a modest white building with ivy growing up the stone columns. The sign read, Dr. Mark Ellery, DVM. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and antiseptic. Behind the counter stood a slim man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair combed back neatly, dressed in a denim shirt tucked into faded slacks. His face bore lines that came from both laughter and loss. Dr. Ellery had lived in Mountain Hollow all his life and had a reputation for being calm, kind, and honest to a fault. He led Rusty into the examination room with a quiet nod to Melissa. You said he's been pacing and refusing food? Melissa nodded, holding Caleb in one arm. And he keeps going to the same spots on the floor. He's acting like he hears something we can't. Mark gently lifted Rusty's ears, listened to his heart, and checked his teeth and joints. Physically, he's in decent shape for his age. Little arthritis in the hips. Scars are all old. But you said he came from Denver? Melissa nodded. A shelter there. They said he might have been a working dog. K9, maybe. Mark stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. Wouldn't surprise me. Look at his posture. Always alert. And that pacing, not nerves. He's tracking something. Melissa frowned. But tracking what? Mark leaned against the counter, his voice thoughtful. Some of these dogs are trained to detect gases, chemicals, leaks. Could be he's remembering something, or picking up something new. Caleb began to fuss, and Melissa bounced him gently. We just moved into an old house. Josh has been fixing things himself. Could it be? Mark raised an eyebrow. I'd have your husband check anything that's gas-powered, just in case. Sometimes these dogs know before we do. Back home that evening, Melissa hesitated before mentioning the vet's advice. Josh was in the garage, his arms dusted with sawdust and oil as he finished a handmade shelf for Caleb's room. He looked tired, a bit more withdrawn than usual. She told him what Dr. Ellery had said. Josh gave a short, dismissive laugh. We've had that furnace checked, twice. It's just an old house creaking. Rusty's probably just bored. Melissa folded her arms. He hasn't eaten in 2 days, and he's shaking. Josh paused, his fingers tightening around the hammer. We'll keep an eye on him, all right, but don't turn every scratch into a disaster warning. He's not Lassie. Melissa didn't argue. But that night, as fog crept up the windows again and the wood stove groaned, Rusty did not lie down. He stood in the kitchen doorway until sunrise, ears perked, watching the vent. By Friday, Rusty began scratching slowly but methodically at the linoleum beneath the kitchen table. Caleb, now pulling himself to a standing wobble on furniture, watched him with fascination, giggling when Rusty circled the base of the table like a sentry. Melissa moved his food bowl, but the dog ignored it. He only drank water, and even that sparingly. The following day, Melissa ran into Frank Yeager at the general store. Frank was a retired electrician in his late 70s, stoop-shouldered but sharp-eyed. He'd lived in Mountain Hollow since the 60s and knew every house like he knew the lines of his own hands. He wore an old green cap and a flannel that looked older than her marriage. After a polite chat about the early thaw, Melissa brought up her concern. Frank, you ever hear about issues with gas lines on Sycamore Hill? The old cabin we bought? It has that old central system. My dog's been acting strange. Frank scratched his chin. Sycamore? That'd be the old Jensen place. I remember they had a busted line under the floorboards back in the 90s. Real small leak, almost invisible. You get headaches in the kitchen? Melissa blinked. Actually, yes. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. Tell your husband to check that connection himself. If it's copper and still using old fittings, you need it replaced. That evening, Melissa relayed the conversation to Josh. He grumbled but eventually agreed to check it. I replaced most of the seals, he muttered, but I'll give it another look tomorrow. But tomorrow would be too late. That night, as frost crept along the window frames and Rusty sat unmoving in front of the kitchen vent, Caleb stirred in his sleep. Melissa awoke and saw Rusty standing at attention beside the crib, his ears rigid, his body taut like a wire. She whispered, Rusty? But the dog didn't respond. He turned, stared at the hallway, and growled a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on Melissa's arms rise. Something wasn't right. The wind had died down by midnight, but the silence in the house was sharp, humming with invisible tension. Outside, the pines swayed slightly under a cloud-covered moon, casting elongated shadows across the frosted yard. Inside the Campbell home, warmth from the wood stove pulsed through the living room, while the bedrooms were dim and quiet. But not everyone slept. Rusty lay in the hallway, his body coiled but rigid, like a spring waiting to uncoil. His one good eye was open, trained toward the baby's room. Every now and then, his nostrils flared. The scent was faint, elusive, tucked beneath layers of pine resin and old wood, but it was growing. In the nursery, Caleb stirred. The soft whir of a nightlight cast a pool of orange over his crib. The room smelled of baby lotion and sleep. Melissa lay half awake in the adjacent bedroom, her body curled protectively toward the wall. Josh snored faintly beside her, one arm flung across his forehead. At 2:14 a.m., Rusty stood, his tail lowered, ears alert. He moved toward Caleb's room with deliberate steps. The baby whimpered softly. Rusty paused, sniffed the air, and let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that hadn't left his chest in years, not since the last emergency that had left a scar across his left rib. Melissa woke instantly. The growl shook her from half-sleep like a cold slap. "Josh!" she whispered. "Rusty's growling." Josh muttered something incomprehensible and turned away, his mind still fogged in dream. Then came the sound, a short, high-pitched hiss from the baseboards in the hallway, like a sigh from the earth itself. Rusty barked, once, sharp and warning. Melissa sat upright. Caleb began to cry, not in his usual whimpering way, but with high-pitched terror. She threw off the blankets. Her feet hit the cold floorboards, and the second she stepped into the hallway, she saw Rusty. He was no longer growling, he was lunging. With astonishing speed for an old dog, he leapt into the nursery, teeth flashing as he bit into the loose fabric of Caleb's sleep sack. The baby shrieked. Melissa screamed, "No, Rusty, stop!" But he didn't hesitate. He turned and dragged the child from the crib, backing out of the room step by step, eyes wild but focused. Josh stumbled from bed, wide-eyed and disoriented. What the hell? The fire alarm hadn't gone off. The lights flickered but stayed on. Everything still looked normal, except for the smell. A sudden rotten egg stench filled the hallway, subtle but undeniable now, like a warning from the belly of the house. Melissa covered her mouth. Gas! Oh my God, it's gas! Rusty bolted down the hallway with Caleb still in his grip. Josh shouted and ran after him, barefoot and panicked. The dog's paws thudded against the stairs. Melissa followed, her heart battering against her ribs. Rusty charged through the dog flap in the back door, and the moment his body crossed into the yard, an invisible force detonated behind them. The explosion shattered the night. A deafening roar surged through the house, followed by a blinding flash. Flames erupted from the kitchen, shattered glass sprayed across the yard, and a cloud of heat threw Melissa and Josh backward. Their screams were swallowed by the thunderous roar as the entire back half of the cabin became a blossom of fire and debris. Josh landed hard in the frostbitten grass, his back scorched and lungs choked with smoke. Melissa rolled near the base of the porch stairs, coughing, her arms shielding her face. When the air stilled again, only moments later, though it felt like an eternity, Rusty was already crouched near the edge of the yard, Caleb still wrapped in the chewed-up sleep sack, miraculously unharmed. The dog trembled but didn't let go until Melissa crawled over, sobbing, to take her son. He was screaming, but breathing. His cheeks were red from the cold, but he was alive. Melissa held him close, her fingers shaking violently. Josh limped toward them, one side of his flannel shirt singed, ash clinging to his hair. He dropped to his knees beside them. "Is he okay?" Melissa nodded, crying too hard to speak. They both looked at Rusty. The old Golden stood, his fur darkened by soot, his chest heaving. His eyes were locked on the burning house, watching it like a soldier who had completed his duty. The flames danced in the reflection of his one good eye, but he didn't flinch. He stood guard, his body between the fire and the child he'd just saved. Behind them, neighbors had begun to appear in bathrobes and boots, drawn by the explosion. Someone yelled to call 911. Flashlights flickered through the dark. A silver pickup truck rolled up the driveway, and a man in a neon yellow volunteer fire vest stepped out. It was Hank Delaney, the town's volunteer fire captain. Stocky and gruff, with a thick gray beard and a no-nonsense scowl, Hank surveyed the blaze and barked orders before even fully closing his door. "Get the hydrant on Sycamore. We've got a basement gas feed. I can smell it from here." He turned to Melissa and Josh. "Anyone else inside?" Josh shook his head. "No, just us and the dog." Hank looked at Rusty, then back at the couple. "Looks like the dog saved your damn lives." Melissa whispered, "He knew. He tried to warn us." As firefighters began to douse the flames and EMTs checked their vitals, Melissa sat on the frosty grass, clutching Caleb and stroking Rusty's scarred head. His fur was singed at the tips, and his paws bled slightly from the glass, but he leaned into her touch like a weary warrior. Josh, staring at the ruin of their home, finally understood what Rusty had been trying to say. All the pacing, the growling, the silent nights at Caleb's crib, the dog had known. And no one had listened. The fire had long been extinguished, but the smoke lingered in the air for days, curling through the trees like a ghost that refused to leave. What remained of the Campbell home was a skeleton of charred beams and collapsed rafters, the blackened foundation still radiating a quiet heat even as the morning frost returned. The town of Mountain Hollow, shaken but alive, wrapped itself around the family in the only way small towns knew how, with blankets, food, silence, and too many questions left respectfully unasked. Melissa and Josh were staying temporarily in a guest room above the town library, courtesy of Ms. Thelma Winters, the librarian and unofficial town historian. Thelma was in her 70s, with silver-streaked curls pinned in tight coils and glasses always perched low on her nose. Though soft-spoken, she had an iron spine forged from years of loss, widowed twice, childless by circumstance, and yet the first to open her doors to anyone in need. Her apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words cut through fog like lantern light. Rusty lay on a folded quilt in the corner of the guest room. His side rose and fell in slow, tired movements. The burns on his paws had been treated by Dr. Ellery, who had stopped by with gauze and ointment and a quiet awe in his eyes. Caleb, remarkably, had resumed his giggles and babble within a day, as though the fire had only been a loud dream. But Melissa could not forget the image of flames reflected in Rusty's eye as he stood between them and the inferno. She had seen more than instinct in him. She had seen purpose. Josh, on the other hand, was unraveling in a different way. The day after the fire, he stood alone at the edge of the wreckage, staring into the blackened ribs of what used to be their kitchen. His hands were in his jacket pockets, clenched tightly, shoulders drawn up like a man bracing against more than just cold. That afternoon, Fire Chief Hank Delaney arrived again. Dressed in jeans and a navy windbreaker bearing the town seal, he carried a clipboard in one hand and a reluctant frown on his weathered face. At 62, Hank had the hardened demeanor of a man who had seen enough disaster to know that mistakes rarely came from malice, but they always came with a price. He stood with Josh beside the remains of the house, looking down at what used to be a utility closet. "We found the source," Hank said plainly. "It was the water heater. The gas line wasn't sealed properly. Connection was hand-threaded, no compound. Probably leaked for days." Josh said nothing. Hank scratched his beard. "You did the installation yourself?" Josh finally nodded, his voice thin. "I thought I could handle it. I followed a video. It looks simple." Hank exhaled through his nose. "You saved $800. You almost cost 3 lives." The words landed like punches, but Josh didn't flinch. He just stared into the ashes, jaw tight. Later that evening, Josh sat alone in the library's small kitchenette. A single light buzzed overhead. He hadn't eaten since morning. Melissa walked in silently, holding Caleb on her hip. Her eyes searched his face for something. Guilt, regret, explanation, anything? He looked up. "It was my fault." She nodded slowly. "I know. I didn't want to tell you," he said, his voice cracking. "About the gas. I figured if I did it right, we'd be fine. I just wanted to prove I could still fix something. Be useful." Melissa placed Caleb into the portable crib beside the table. "You are useful, Josh, but being useful isn't the same as being safe. You lied by omission, and you didn't listen. Not to me, not to Rusty." Josh buried his face in his hands. "I was going to get rid of him. Did you know that? I'd been messaging a guy about taking him in, said he was too much." Melissa's face went still. "But he saved our son," Josh whispered. "He saved you and me. I don't know how I'll ever repay that." For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was Caleb's soft sighs as he slept. The next morning, a knock came at the library apartment door. Melissa opened it to find a woman in a burgundy coat, tall and striking, with dark skin and tight braids gathered into a neat bun. She carried a folder and wore a badge clipped to her chest that read, "Andrea Cole, County Fire Marshal Investigator." Andrea spoke with calm precision. She explained that an official investigation had been opened to document the cause of the explosion, and she needed to take a statement from Josh. She took a seat at Thelma's dining table and unfolded her papers. "Mr. Campbell, I understand you personally installed the gas line for the new water heater." Josh nodded. "Did you acquire a permit?" He shook his head. "No, I didn't think we needed one." "Are you a licensed plumber?" "No." Andrea's pen scratched across the form. Her face betrayed no judgment, only procedure. "Your actions may fall under a category of negligence. I can't say yet whether charges will be filed. That decision rests with the district attorney, but you should know this could have ended much worse." Josh swallowed hard. "I do know." Before she left, Andrea turned to Melissa. "I also want to note, your dog's actions were extraordinary. The fire department filed an addendum on him. His response was consistent with K9 gas detection behavior. You may want to speak with the local SAR training center. They may know more about his background." After she left, Melissa turned toward Rusty, who now lay with his head resting on one paw, eyes open and watching her. She knelt beside him. "Did you do this before?" she whispered. "Save people who didn't listen until it was too late?" Rusty didn't move, but his ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and his tail gave a small, tired wag. 3 days after the fire, the snow returned to Mountain Hollow in soft flurries that dusted the rooftops and blanketed the roads like powdered sugar. The town had gone quieter than usual, as if collectively holding its breath. In the library apartment, the Campbell family settled into a rhythm of survival shared breakfasts at Thelma's table, whispered nighttime talks, and daily efforts to rebuild what had been lost. But amidst the smoke-scented clothes and restless sleep, something lingered unspoken between them, the mystery of Rusty. Melissa couldn't let it go. She'd seen too much behind his eyes, the way he moved before the explosion, how he'd calculated every step, how he hadn't hesitated when everyone else froze. It wasn't luck, it was training. One morning, after putting Caleb down for his nap, she opened her laptop and began searching. She found forums for retired working dogs, lists of K9 units across the state, and news articles archived from Denver. Most of it led nowhere until she stumbled on an old article from 2 years ago titled "K9 Saves Workers in Chemical Plant Explosion." The image showed a younger version of Rusty wearing a black vest marked "Search and Rescue," standing beside a firefighter in full gear. The article detailed a gas leak at a chemical storage facility in northern Denver. A golden retriever named Ranger had detected an unusual odor and barked until his handler followed him inside, seconds before a rupture. 3 workers were evacuated in time. The article quoted his handler as saying, "He acted on his own, didn't wait for my command, he was too independent, but he was right." Melissa sat back in her chair, stunned. Ranger? That had to be him. Later that afternoon, she made a call to the training facility listed in the article. The woman who answered had a warm, efficient voice, Catherine Monroe, director of the Rocky Mountain K9 Response Program. In her early 40s, Catherine had the composed air of someone used to high-pressure situations. Her voice carried calm authority. "Golden, scars on the muzzle? That sounds like Ranger? We called him Maverick for a while. He was one of our top olfactory dogs, passed everything but field compliance, too self-directed. After the chemical incident, his handler left the program, and Maverick was retired. We lost track of him." Melissa explained how they had adopted Rusty, the fire, and the dog's role in saving them. There was a long pause on the other end before Catherine said softly, "He still remembers." 2 days later, Catherine drove in from Fort Collins. She arrived in a dusty green SUV with a crate in the back and the faint scent of cedar clinging to her wool coat. Tall and broad-shouldered, with copper hair tied in a loose bun and hiking boots caked in mud, she looked more like a wilderness guide than a trainer. Her handshake was firm but kind. When she saw Rusty, who approached her cautiously, ears perked, Catherine knelt and whispered his old name. "Maverick!" His tail moved, a slow, unsure rhythm. Melissa watched in awe as Rusty allowed her to touch the faded spot on his shoulder where the Sayar patch once rested. "He remembers the uniform," Catherine said. "They always do." They sat in Thelma's parlor, the fireplace crackling softly behind them. Catherine pulled out a file folder, thick and creased with age. Inside were photos, certificates, and evaluations. One showed Rusty as a young dog, sleek, golden, with sharp, intelligent eyes. Another was a report. Maverick demonstrates non-standard alert behavior, physically moves handler away from perceived danger without command, shows signs of hyper-independence. "He was brilliant," Catherine said. "His nose was like a radar, but he didn't wait for approval. In structured teams, that's dangerous. He was flagged as too unpredictable. But now, what he did for your son." She shook her head. "That's exactly what made him special." Josh, who had stayed silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "So he was discarded because he acted too soon?" Catherine's expression softened. "He wasn't discarded. He was misunderstood, and maybe a little too ahead of his time." After she left, Melissa sat beside Rusty on the floor. Caleb crawled over, tugged at the dog's ear, and Rusty gently nuzzled the boy's cheek. His scars no longer looked like remnants of damage, but like proof of purpose. That evening, Josh made a quiet decision. He walked to the fire station and asked for Hank. The volunteer fire chief, still in his suspenders and ash-stained boots, raised an eyebrow. Need something? Josh nodded. I need to tell the full truth. They sat in Hank's cramped office, where a calendar with pictures of rescue dogs hung crookedly on the wall. Josh detailed everything: the missing permit, the online tutorial, the skipped inspection. He admitted the fear behind his choices, the fear of failure, of inadequacy, of not being enough. Hank didn't interrupt. When Josh finished, he nodded once. I'll include it in the report. You may get a fine, maybe more, but I've seen worse. What matters is you owned it. As Josh left the station, he saw a mural near the park being repainted by a group of local volunteers. Among them was Sophie Tran, a high school senior with long black hair tied in a messy bun and paint-streaked jeans. She was quiet, observant, often misunderstood as aloof, but had a gift for memorial art. She was painting a silhouette of a dog with wings. For the one that saved the baby, she said simply when Josh asked. The following week brought a strange stillness to Mountain Hollow One that didn't come from the snow or the cold, but from the weight of what had been narrowly avoided. Word of Rusty's heroic act had spread beyond the town's quiet borders. Articles appeared in local papers. Social media posts about the scarred Golden who saved a baby were shared thousands of times. But inside the library's guest department, the Campbell family was moving through the aftermath, not with pride, but with a slow, cautious humility. Josh had begun waking up early, often before sunrise. He no longer stayed curled under the covers like before. Instead, he dressed in silence, packed a thermos of weak coffee, and went walking along the snow-dusted edges of the town. He needed the stillness, the cold air biting at his skin. It was penance in motion. That morning, he stood outside the smoldering remains of the house once more. A wooden stake now marked the boundary of the foundation, painted orange by city code officials. The land smelled of smoke and something deeper, something like regret soaked into the soil. Later, he visited the Mountain Hollow Town Hall. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn Moore, greeted him with a polite but guarded expression. Evelyn was round-faced with short salt-colored hair and eyes that never missed a detail. She had worked at the hall for 20 years, had buried 2 brothers and a son to accidents caused by shortcut decisions, as she called them, and she didn't have much sympathy for negligence. I need to file for an official statement of liability, Josh said quietly, placing the form Hank had given him on the desk, for the explosion. Evelyn glanced at it, then at him. You know this might make things harder with your insurance. I know, he said, voice firm, but I want the record to reflect what really happened. No excuses. She studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod and took the form. Back at the library, Melissa was feeding Caleb, while Rusty lay in the sunlit patch near the window, his head resting on his front paws. The wounds on his legs were healing, but slowly. Melissa had taken to wrapping them herself each night, her fingers moving with careful tenderness. Despite everything, Rusty never whimpered. Melissa's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophie Tran, the young artist who had painted Rusty's silhouette in the park. It read, "The mural's finished. Thought you might want to see." She bundled up Caleb and left a note for Josh, then walked with Rusty on a loose leash through the quiet town. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots, and the wind was calm, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. They passed by the elementary school, then the shuttered bakery, and finally reached the park's outer wall. The mural was breathtaking. Sophie had painted Rusty mid-run, his fur windswept and eyes glowing, dragging a trail of gold behind him that spiraled into images of fire, family, and a baby's crib. Surrounding him were faint shapes of other dogs, ghostly outlines of service animals past watching from the clouds. The words at the bottom read, "Instinct is not disobedience, it's a gift." Sophie stood nearby, bundled in a puffy gray jacket, hands stained with blue and white paint. Her expression was unreadable until Melissa hugged her. "It's beautiful," she said. "You captured him." Sophie smiled slightly. "My brother was saved by a search dog in a landslide years ago. I guess I've been waiting for a reason to say thank you." Meanwhile, Josh had returned home to find an envelope waiting on the library table. It was from the county prosecutor's office. With trembling hands, he opened it. No criminal charges to be filed. Fine imposed, $20,500. Recommendation: Community education outreach on safe home installations. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The weight of prison, of headlines, of Caleb growing up hearing his father was the man who endangered them all lifted, just enough to breathe. That evening, Melissa sat with Josh near the fireplace. Caleb was asleep in the borrowed crib beside them, and Rusty lay curled at their feet. The silence between them wasn't strained anymore. It was reflective. "I saw the mural," Melissa said. "Sophie finished it. It's powerful." Josh nodded. "I'll go tomorrow." There was a pause. Then she added, "I saw the envelope too." Josh looked down. "I was ready to be punished. I still feel like I should be." Melissa didn't speak right away. Then she said, "You were careless, yes, and stubborn. But you've owned it. That matters to me. What matters even more is who you are now, not who you were when you tightened that pipe." He exhaled slowly. "I still wake up at night hearing the boom." "So do I," she admitted. "But now I also wake up and see Caleb sleeping peacefully. And I see Rusty. That dog didn't ask for redemption, but he gave us one anyway." Just then, Rusty lifted his head and licked Josh's hand. Josh looked down, smiling through wet eyes. "I wanted to get rid of you, buddy. And you saved us all." Melissa leaned her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to keep proving yourself to me, Josh. Just keep showing up. That's enough." The next day, Josh stood before a room of 12 people in the town library's community center. They were all residents, mostly older men and women, with notepads in their laps and cautious curiosity in their eyes. Rusty lay beside him, quiet and steady. Behind them, Sophie's mural had been printed and mounted on a board. Josh cleared his throat. "I'm not a contractor. I'm not a plumber. I was just a man trying to save money and prove I could handle a new start. I made a mistake. I cut corners. I almost paid with my family's lives. But a dog we almost gave up on saved us." He looked down at Rusty. "This is what listening looks like." Early spring had finally broken through the gray and mountain hollow. The snow retreated into memory, replaced by buds poking through wet soil and bird song that filtered through the town like a gentle announcement. Life was beginning again. The old library guest apartment still held the Campbell family's laughter and quiet nights. But there was something different now. The heaviness had lightened, replaced with a sense of possibility. One morning, Josh stood at the edge of a newly cleared lot, what used to be their home. The charred debris had been removed, and in its place was the raw, empty shape of a future. A string marked off the new foundation lines, and beside him stood Gabe Alvarez, a local contractor and co-owner of Alvarez & Sons, a sustainable building firm. Gabe was in his late 40s, with sun-weathered skin, a dark beard flecked with silver, and a quiet focus honed through years of building with intention. He wore canvas work pants, steel-toed boots, and always had a pencil tucked behind his ear. "We'll lay the new foundation next week," Gabe said, pointing with a rolled blueprint. "Insulated slab, full code compliance, no shortcuts." Josh nodded. "That's exactly what I want." "I heard you speak at the library," Gabe added, his voice low but sincere. "Takes a lot to own up like that. I lost a cousin in a furnace fire when I was a kid. Your story, it hit home." Josh was quiet a moment. "It's not just my story anymore. It belongs to my son, and that dog." Gabe smiled slightly. "Well, we could always use help, if you're looking for work." Josh blinked. "Seriously? We hire local when we can. You've got a background in IT? We need someone to help with logistics, inventory systems. And someone who knows what not to do is sometimes the best teacher." That evening, Josh told Melissa, and she beamed. "You're building again, but this time, not just walls." A few days later, the town hosted the Spring Renewal Festival, a modest but cherished event held in the town square. Booths were set up with homemade crafts, pies, knitted goods, and wooden toys. Musicians strummed acoustic guitars on the gazebo stage, and kids ran with painted faces and sticky hands. Melissa, now volunteering on the festival committee, stood at a booth beside Rusty, who lay on a donated cushion under a table marked Heroes of Hollow. Passers-by stopped to pet Rusty and hear his story. Some left donations in a jar that read, "Help rebuild the Campbell home." Others simply whispered, "Thank you," and moved on, eyes glistening. Nearby, a photographer from the Colorado Sentinel, a lean woman named Nina Patel, approached. In her 30s, with cropped black hair, khaki cargo pants, and a camera that never left her side, she had a reputation for chasing stories of overlooked courage. She crouched to Rusty's level and clicked a few shots. "Is it true?" she asked Melissa, her tone both curious and reverent. "He pulled your baby out seconds before the explosion?" Melissa nodded. "He knew, before any of us did. I'd love to feature him in the Sunday issue, not just the rescue, but his whole journey, the scars, the past training, the redemption. People need that kind of story." Melissa smiled softly. "We did too." At the end of the festival, the mayor, Edwin Rowe, took the stage. A round, affable man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and a red wool vest, Edwin always spoke as if the entire town were his family. He adjusted his mic and waved a hand toward the crowd. "This town has seen hardship," he said, "but we've also seen heroism, and not just from people. Today we honor a four-legged friend who reminded us that instinct, love, and loyalty can sometimes see what we don't." He motioned for Melissa to bring Rusty up. She did, and the applause that followed brought tears to her eyes. Rusty stood still, tail swaying, eyes calm but alert. A golden ribbon was gently tied around his collar. Edwin added, "Let it be known, Rusty is now the official mascot of the Mountain Hollow Volunteer Rescue Council." Later that night, at the library apartment, Caleb sat beside Rusty, his tiny fingers threading through the old dog's fur. A knock came at the door. It was Catherine Monroe. She stepped in carrying a small duffel and a manila folder. "Thought I'd stop by. I have something you might want." She placed the folder on the table. Inside were documents, photos, and Rusty's full training records, everything the shelter had never included. "We've started a legacy program," Catherine explained, "for retired working dogs who find new purpose. We want Rusty to be our founding story. His scars, his instincts, they're not flaws, they're proof of resilience." Josh joined them, flipping through the papers slowly. "You sure he's up for more?" Catherine looked at Rusty, who had gently rested his head in Caleb's lap. "He's already doing the work." He never stopped. As the moon rose over Mountain Hollow, casting silver light across the rooftops and soft shadows through the pine trees, the Campbells sat in silence around their dog. There was no more urgency, no more fear, just a quiet knowing that something extraordinary had risen from their ashes. Summer came early to Mountain Hollow that year, and with it, the scent of sawdust and lilac filled the air. On the edge of town, where once blackened timber had told a story of tragedy, a new shape was rising from the soil. One beam, one nail, one breath at a time. The Campbell home, redesigned with care and safety in mind, now stood proud beneath the open sky. It wasn't larger than the original, nor fancier, but it held something the first never had: intention. Josh stood with a level in hand, checking the slope of the front porch railing. His jeans were scuffed at the knees, his t-shirt damp with sweat, but his face wore a lightness that hadn't been there in months. Beside him, Gabe Alvarez gave a small, approving grunt. "Not bad," Gabe said, adjusting his tool belt. "You've got an eye for detail now." "I had a hell of a teacher," Josh replied. They shared a grin, then returned to work. Inside, Melissa unpacked a box of Caleb's toys, setting them in a soft basket by the window. The walls smelled of fresh paint and lemon oil. The floors gleamed under the sunlight that spilled through wide, reinforced windows. She wore a linen dress, her hair now grown past her shoulders and tied back with a patterned scarf. There was a glow about her, a peace that came not from perfection, but from perseverance. Caleb, now walking with a toddler's wobbly confidence, toddled across the room and collapsed, giggling onto a rug shaped like a bear. His laughter echoed warmly off the new walls. Rusty sat near the back door, eyes half closed, a contented sigh rising from his chest. His scars remained, some softened by time, others still visible, but none dimmed the softness in his gaze or the steady rhythm of his tail. A new orthopedic bed had been placed beside the sliding door, Melissa's idea. Rusty preferred the floor, but humored her efforts. Later that day, the Campbells hosted a modest open house. Friends, neighbors, and even former strangers came to bless the new space. Thelma Winters brought jars of spice jam wrapped in gingham. Hank Delaney arrived in uniform, carrying a housewarming gift, a handmade wooden sign that read, "Safe at last." Evelyn Moore brought a lemon cake and even cracked a rare smile. Nina Patel returned too, this time without a camera. She carried a copy of the Colorado Sentinel's latest issue, folded to the feature titled Rusty, the Dog Who Rebuilt a Family. Inside was a photo of Rusty with Caleb asleep against him, and the closing line, "Some guardians wear badges, some wear fur." Around twilight, Catherine Monroe pulled into the driveway. She wore hiking pants and a field vest, her auburn hair in a braid. She greeted Rusty first, crouching to stroke the soft place behind his ear. "You've aged, old man," she whispered, not unkindly. She had come to drop off something special, a leather tag engraved with Rusty's full training name, Maverick SR Class XC, Gas and Rescue Certified. It was attached to a sturdy red collar, which she gently handed to Melissa. "He should wear this when he visits schools," Catherine said. "He's earned it." The moment was quiet, reverent. Rusty didn't protest as Melissa clipped the collar around his neck. He simply lay his head on her foot, eyes soft. At dusk, the crowd thinned. Sophie Tran remained behind to hang a frame print of the mural she'd painted, now replicated above the fireplace in the new living room. She wore a white t-shirt, splattered with paint, and her usual worn sneakers. Her eyes lingered on Rusty before she gave him a final scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," she said, "still the best face I've ever painted." As stars began to bloom above the trees, the Campbells sat together on the porch. Josh's arm rested lightly around Melissa's shoulder. Caleb curled up against Rusty's side, a picture book forgotten on the porch swing. The hum of crickets rose in the distance, and the sky glowed with the last lavender hues of evening. "This place," Melissa said quietly, "feels like ours now. Not just a house, a home." Josh nodded. "Because we built it with truth this time." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the small sounds that made life feel full. Caleb's gentle breaths, the creak of the porch swing, the low grunt from Rusty as he adjusted his weight. It was the sound of ordinary miracles. Inside, pinned to the new refrigerator, was a note written in Melissa's handwriting. "Never ignore the warning bark. Never underestimate the second chance." It had become their family's quiet motto. When the moon climbed high and Caleb was lifted gently into bed, Rusty followed and took his usual place by the foot of the crib. The house exhaled into stillness. And though no alarms rang and no threats lingered, the old Golden stayed watchful, as he always had, not because he was told to, but because some hearts are made for guardianship. The scars we carry, whether on our skin or in our hearts, don't make us weaker. Sometimes they're what prepare us to protect the ones we love when no one else can. In a world full of noise, it's often the quiet guardians like Rusty who teach us the most about love, trust, and showing up when it matters most. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. And tell us below, have you ever been saved in any way by someone everyone else overlooked?